Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the event coordinator for National Leadership in Education here at Community Progress. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we're joined by Liz Kozub, Torrey Park, and Laura Ginn. Liz Kozub is the Associate Director of National Technical Assistance at Community Progress. In her role, Kozub works directly with local government decision makers, grassroots leaders, and other community stakeholders across the country to deliver a range of technical assistance and capacity building services to urban, rural, and suburban communities. Kozub received an MPA from the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and a BA in Political Science from Allegheny College. She's based in Buffalo, New York. Torrey Park is the director of the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative and is responsible for supporting the Vacancy Collaborative's 200 plus members in setting priorities, developing work plans, evaluating progress, and leading funding and sustainability efforts. Torrey has worked in nonprofit and community development for more than 20 years and holds a bachelor's degree in parks, recreation, and tourism and a certificate in nonprofit management. Torrey believes when it comes to addressing vacancy issues, it is key to prioritize racial equity and systems-level change with community at the center. Laura Ginn serves as the City of St. Louis's vacancy strategist, working across departments and within communities to align resources and catalyze equitable reinvestment in high vacancy neighborhoods. With a master's degree in conservation and master's certificate in GIS, Laura combines more than 15 years of experience in research and project management with geospatial and community planning to inform local land use decisions and policies. She strives to infuse best practices and data and community-based decision-making into government processes while increasing collaboration, transparency, and accountability. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please click the Stage tab on the right of your screen, select Chat, and type your question into the chat box. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz.
Great, thanks so much, Julia, and thank you everybody for joining today's webinar on utilizing partnerships and collaborations in vacant land stewardship. As Julia mentioned, I am located just outside of Buffalo, New York, and knock on wood, it's hopefully stopped snowing, which means that grass is going to start growing. And if you're coming from a city with a large inventory of vacant and unmaintained lots, you know firsthand how much of a challenge these properties can cause to local governments and communities and how much harm they have on residents and community members. And so my goal today and my role is really to just provide a very brief overview on vacant land stewardship and what we mean by it here at Community Progress and talk about the integral role of partnerships in this work. And then I'm going to turn it over to Torrey and Laura to discuss their experiences and successes and the lessons they've learned in collaborating with partners on addressing vacant lot challenges. If you could go to the next slide. So let's start off with the definition. For Community Progress, vacant land stewardship means the comprehensive intentional repurposing and maintenance of all vacant lots in a community in service to community needs, priorities, and goals. If you could go to the next slide. Over the last few years, Community Progress has been working with a number of practitioners and researchers to really identify and tease out what are the fundamental elements to doing vacant land stewardship in a way that's equitable, that's efficient, and that's effective. And unsurprisingly, partnerships are critical to all four of these elements that you see here on your screen. I'm going to go into them at a very high level, but my colleague Janelle O'Keefe has given past presentations that dive into these elements in a much deeper respect. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to check out our existing resources. Next slide. So it's really hard to address a problem without understanding its full scope. And both quantitative and qualitative data can really help provide that understanding for communities. And the data types that are on your screen and really the questions that we're encouraging folks to answer are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding the challenges of vacant lots within your community. And I want to stress here that it's not a single department within local government or a single CDC or a block club that has all of this information. It really takes a lot of partnerships to develop that context around vacant land. So for example, residents and trusted community-based groups can provide really critical historical context on vacant lots within neighborhoods. Legacy residents can share anecdotes about what happened in that particular neighborhood. Maybe there was once a thriving business that is now a vacant lot and might have been demolished. There might have been some equity concerns around that, and there might be existing hopes and dreams for what that lot could be in the future. So another example, understanding the scope and scale of vacancy takes a lot of intergovernmental partnerships and a lot of sharing and analyzing of data across departments. So code enforcement departments might have really critical information on vacant lots because they're citing property owners for unmaintained lots. Tax collectors can have a good view of what long-term delinquency of vacant lots looks like within a particular neighborhood or community. And maybe your public works is charged with actually removing dumping that oftentimes happens on these lots and causes a lot of issues for neighbors and neighborhoods. So these departments need to work in partnership with each other. Not just the people need to talk to each other, but the data sets and the systems that those departments are using to collect that data also need to be able to talk to each other. And it's also important to understand who is already reactivating or working on vacant lot issues within your community. What type of information do they have that can provide a better understanding of the scope, and also the information that they could share related to potential future reuses. Go to the next slide. Communities will be really hard pressed to capitalize on the opportunities that vacant land presents without having taken the time to set collective goals and priorities. And developing an effective and trusted plan takes a lot of partnerships. It takes a lot of time and listening and the willingness to really get the information right in the time it takes to do that. So really successful plans require centering residents' voices, especially those most harmed by vacancy. And in the context of vacant lot, oftentimes residents are bearing the burden of maintaining them if they're close to where they're living or working. So the plan should really take their opinions and voices into what happens on those lots next. And plans should really focus on equitable outcomes for existing residents. And addressing a few vacant lots here and there isn't going to address kind of the full scope of vacancy or have super impactful and meaningful change within a community. So we do encourage our partners to really think about how a plan can address the full inventory of vacant lots that might exist. And lastly, plans need to be regularly revisited and adapted and reflective to current contexts and neighborhood priorities. Next slide, please. In order for vacant land stewardship to be successful, communities need to ensure their policies don't prohibit vacant lot reuse strategies and ideally enable new uses on vacant lots, especially those that can align with community goals. And so there are a number of policies that are on your screen and a number of policies that touch vacant land reuse. And I say this not to overwhelm, but really to point out the potential partnerships that could exist with the folks that may have some authority over these different policies. So waste management policies, for example, could affect green stormwater infrastructure projects that go into a community, or zoning could allow for certain reuses on vacant lots. And there's internal policies that may dictate if publicly owned lots can be leased to community groups and what type of insurance and liability coverages might need to be met for that. So there's different partnerships that can go into refining those policies and making sure that they can be utilized for vacant land repurposing. And policies need to be accessible. The partners that you want doing this work need to be able to access them and understand them. So it's important to just continue to reflect on those policies, make sure that they're accessible and usable, and again, can be adaptive over time. Next slide, please. And vacant land stewardship truly takes a village, and everybody has a role to play in this work. And these relationships get built over time. working with partners to gather data, to understand community context, to develop that shared vision, to refine policies and think about new policies can help to repair relationships or build new relationships, and also establish collaborative partnerships to really sustain this work moving forward. Collaboration is also incredibly necessary in terms of a fundraising strategy. Some of the most successful projects that we've seen have been able to leverage different types of funding sources, from public to private to philanthropic to donations of actual materials and plants and tools that might be needed to address vacant land. So bringing together all of these pots of fundings and resources can really stretch everybody's dollar in this work. Next slide, please. So Community Progress has a lot of information about vacant land stewardship on our website. We have example projects that I encourage you all to take a look at and consider us a resource as you're thinking about your vacant land stewardship within your community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Torrey and Laura to talk about how they've actualized this work in St. Louis.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I am Torrey Park. I am the director of the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative. Just wanted to say very happy to be here and speak with you all today. You'll be hearing from my colleague, Laura Ginn, a little further down as we talk about partnerships with the Vacancy Collaborative. But first, I wanted to just give a little bit of an overview as to what we'll go through today and a little background on both the vacancy landscape of St. Louis and also a little bit of information about the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative. Next slide. So again, going into the unique level of vacancy that we have here in St. Louis. We'll talk about some of those collaborative issues. First, on the Vacancy Collaborative side, talking about land stewardship, and two of the categories that the Vacancy Collaborative is known for in terms of projects highlighting data and transparency, and also research and recommendations. And then I'll turn it over to Laura for information about the Green City Coalition and community green space successes. And then we'll wrap it up with how those two entities come together. Next slide. So essentially, since around 2018, St. Louis City has been placed in the top 5 for cities with a high rate of vacant and abandoned properties. We have an average at any given time of 25,000 vacant properties. The vacant lots actually outnumber buildings 3 to 2, with about 15,000 vacant lots and 10,000 vacant buildings. Beyond the sheer number of these properties and the burden it places on the city's to date limited ability to abate structural, environmental, and maintenance concerns, it's also important to understand that there is a human cost. For example, approximately 65% of St. Louis City's Black population lives in a high vacancy census tract compared with 19% of the white population. As you will see further down in our presentation, you'll notice on our map from our Vacant Property Explorer tool that vacancy skews heavily towards concentrated parts of the city, mostly on the north side. The result is lower property values, higher rates of drug and gun crimes, illegal dumping, environmental health, and of course, lower quality of life. The vacancy issue is highly intersectional. It impacts our health, safety, and well-being, and it is a signifier of inequitable development and fewer resources along a racial and economic dividing line. The city cannot fix this massive problem alone, and what it comes down to is that this is a neighborhood, community, and equitable development issue. The St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative was formed with this belief at the core of what we do. Next slide. Who are we? We are a coalition of partners committed to reducing vacant property in the city of St. Louis. We are made up of community representatives, private and nonprofit stakeholders, and city agencies. We help to coordinate existing vacancy efforts under one umbrella and work together towards solutions in a comprehensive and coordinated way. Mostly we are a convener, a collective of subject matter experts and concerned residents, a connector between the community and city leaders, and a developer of public-facing, accessible tools and resources. And then lastly, but not least, an originator of policy and legislative solutions for systemic level change. Next slide. So just a very brief background on how we are oriented. We operate off of an 18-month work plan to align with 5 different focus areas. This is to set achievable goals within that period and measure progress made by 5 different project groups. Relevant to today's discussion, we had the Alternative Land Reuse, aka Vacant Lots group, who identified the following goals within this 18-month period: to create and implement an engagement and outreach plan for the Vacant Lot Toolkit that we'll get into a little later, identify and pursue funding opportunities for these projects, and to create a framework for community-led prioritization of vacant lots. So that's going to feed into our partnership with the Green City Coalition. But in the next few slides, I'd like to share 2 examples of how the VC supports land stewardship through, again, data transparency and research and recommendations. Next slide. So we have back in 2019, the VC began developing an online mapping and statistical portal. We call it the Vacant Property Explorer, and it is designed for visualizing and reviewing pertinent information about potentially vacant properties in the city of St. Louis. Data is collected from multiple publicly available data sets of several city sources, including building division, forestry, and our Citizens Service Bureau. It also looks at tax history, just any number of things to help identify what might be a vacant property and to calculate the burden score for the city for those vacant properties. So since its launch, which was, I believe, around July of 2021, when I joined the organization, we've seen that neighborhood groups and the general public have been utilizing it in a number of ways to track and understand the conditions and burden of vacant properties. And then also city departments regularly use this tool to identify properties for intentional redevelopment, including those looking to acquire side lots and standalone spaces for green infrastructure. Next slide. So there's a lot that goes into the vacant lot designation in particular that differentiates from vacant buildings. But the likelihood of a parcel being vacant, obviously we know that anything that is in the city's land bank inventory can be counted automatically, as well as properties that the building division's vacant building registry has put together, and they are assigned the maximum score. Additionally, other vacant land is identified by forestry if they've been called to the scene to assess the property, request for service, and demolition if it has occurred. And next slide, please. So moving on to our research and recommendations. A lot of what we do is grounded in data and community input. And we've had some foundational documents that truly helped form the Vacancy Collaborative, as well as it continues to inform our strategy today. This includes just 2 years prior to the launch of the Vacancy Collaborative in 2018, the Center for Community Progress worked with the City of St. Louis and other stakeholders to develop and release a report as far as developing a shared vision and strategies to address vacancy and abandonment. And the following year, a consulting firm called Asakura Robinson was engaged by the city and released a St. Louis land bank assessment. So based upon these extensive reports and the Vacancies Collaborative's first and second Vacancy Summit, this is really the background to the evolution of how we approach vacancy today. And then lastly, in the past year, with the announcement of St. Louis set to receive more than $200 million in ARPA funds, this fed into the VC creating a comprehensive funding recommendation document, which we have shared with elected officials at all levels. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to address the vacancy challenge in a significant systemic way. So based upon that, I wanted to turn it over to Laura Ginn, my colleague, to talk a little bit about Green City Coalition and the work that they're doing. Next slide.
Thank you, Torrey. All right, so the next collaborative initiative, like Vacancy Collaborative, Green City, and also say GCC a lot from here on, is another non-entity. Neither of these are established legal entities. They are collaborative initiatives. Green City Coalition's initiative is framed by partnership agreements between the City of St. Louis, primarily our forestry department, which is responsible for maintaining all vacant properties in the city, in addition to our city's street tree inventory and our planning department. It involves my office, St. Louis Development Corporation, which is the city's economic development arm and the umbrella organization over our land bank, LRA, the oldest state land bank in the nation, which owns about 1,500 buildings and 8,500 vacant lots. Our outside partners are our local sewer district, MSD, which has a consent decree mandate to reduce combined sewer overflows. And then finally, and probably most crucially to getting this off the ground, is our state Fish and Wildlife Agency, the Missouri Department of Conservation. The partner agreements between all of these entities state our collective goal as identifying concentrations of vacant and abandoned properties to convert to new community green spaces and ultimately improve environmental and public health. What brought these groups together was a bit of a serendipitous convergence of a lot of events in 2017. Missouri Department of Conservation had already been a partner with the city for several years, and their goal was really to connect city residents with nature. But with a strategic shift, they wanted to increase those efforts and increase their impact with residents living in disinvested and high vacancy communities. Our sewer district, with the consent decree, included an allocation of $13.5 million to be spent on removing impervious surface in our combined sewer district, which overlays with our high vacancy areas. So through a partnership with the planning department, it was determined to spend that $13.5 million to remove vacant and abandoned buildings, kind of a 3D approach to impervious surface removal. And then similar to what kind of bubbled up into the creation of the Vacancy Collaborative, we had the first mayoral transition in 16 years in our city, and a true rising of political and community interest in finally addressing this wide swath of vacant and abandoned properties in the city. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right, our activities and investments really center around the identification, planning, and creation of these green spaces, as well as ongoing maintenance. And I wanted to show the staffing here on the right to highlight the challenge of building out a sustainable staff for collaborative work like this. When we first started, we were working with independent contractors. These were grant-funded positions working as consultants to the city. They were 1099 employees. They did not have benefits. And so we experienced quite a bit of turnover in the early years and have really worked over the last 5-6 years to embed those positions into the city. And so today we have salaried positions in the forestry department, overseeing land management and working with additional forestry crews. We have staff inside the planning department and environmental planner. And there are 3 positions at SLDC that work on Green City project management, though several are vacant at the moment. But now those positions are salaried with benefits, and we see a much better kind of return on investment for the work. Next slide. So how do we determine locations? This is a bit of a combination of data-driven and community refined. So kind of at the root of location selection is it's missing a word there on the slide, a couple words, open space prioritization model. So this is a GIS-based modeling tool that we developed in the early years to help identify concentrations of vacant properties. So it looks for clusters of concentrations of vacant land and then scores those clusters of properties based on their potential to absorb stormwater and reduce our combined sewer overflows, their potential to create open space where there is a gap currently, their potential to connect existing parks and green spaces into more of a network, and to kind of stay off of main roads and areas that are prime for structural development and keep us more internal to community and to neighborhoods. But then we take the results of that model and host participatory mapping workshops with neighborhoods. This is what the mapping says about what might be a good spot for permanent green space in your neighborhood. But let's align that with what the community knows about where people spend their time or would want to, what makes the most sense, where there are water problem areas, where are the kids at, things like that. And it's the combination of those two that led us to the 7 project sites we currently have in 4 neighborhoods. Those are all in North City neighborhoods: College Hill, Walnut Park, Wells Goodfellow, and Baden. Now, the actual form of the green spaces is a next step of planning into that kind of green space design, and is defined by the neighborhoods as well. So there's a wide variety. Sometimes in kind of the more vacant neighborhoods with a kind of less interest in creating more green space, it's a simple conversion of land to a lower maintenance with prairie-like plantings. We have 2 community gardens, 2 community orchards. In the real water problem areas, sometimes we end up with some rain gardens. And then we have some park-like spaces that are more focused on community gathering spaces and activities. And I'll show 2 examples of those in a minute. In the long run, the goal is to transfer these spaces to community ownership in the form of a land trust. That's something that the work's been going on for years, was a bit delayed by COVID and other factors, but is kicking back into gear. As we speak. We have a business plan, 5-year funding model, some initial endowments and investments ready. But the goal is to build the spaces as reflected by communities' desires and then transfer that ownership to the neighborhoods themselves. Next slide. So a little bit about those native plantings. There's a lot of interest across the country. This is a conversation I hear all the time about converting swaths of land to native vegetation or some other non-grass cover that could ideally be lower maintenance and lower cost. And so sharing a little bit about what we've learned in that effort. We do have about 100 parcels totaling about 15 acres, excuse me, of previously vacant land that's either been converted or is actively under conversion to Missouri native plantings. We tend to say things like prairie-like because they're too small to really call them a prairie, or pocket prairies. Ooh, got a tickle. And since the inception of this, we've also expanded those efforts to our city parks. So we have about 50 acres of land inside parks and medians that were previously turf grass that have been converted to natives as well. I hope I can speak better soon. We might have to tap Torrey in. All right. Some lessons we've learned from that. So this process absolutely takes a minimum of 3 to 5 years to transfer from weed banks that have been embedded in the soil for decades to a truly native self-sustaining planting. And that requires a pretty hefty upfront investment, both in time and in money. Fortunately, because that's usually something that outside partners have an investment in, we were able to bring in outside funding through grants and partnerships so that that initial upfront cost and investment isn't borne by the city or the Parks Department themselves, but something we can supplement from outside partnerships. But in the implementation, there's a limited expertise. It is not the same land management as turf. It does not require the same type of companies. So we've struggled to find kind of enough of that expertise to get that initial management going. And it doesn't completely eliminate the need for general upkeep, mowing, and maintenance that has to happen every 10 to 14 days. We're mowing buffers around the edges of the prairie-like plantings to keep it clean, keep sidewalks clean. You still have to do tree lawns. There's still trash removal. So it doesn't eliminate that, but it just kind of changes the dynamic of that land management and maintenance. And it requires quite an investment in staffing, both while you're setting up to do this work, but while you're carrying it out as well. And that's because the properties can look unintentional. They can look like the same as any other vacant lot if you're not having ongoing conversations about how this transition is going to look over time, especially in the winter. Native plantings are not necessarily attractive. So we work hard to try to maintain that communication with residents that are most close to these sites, installing signage, again, keeping the external areas very clean and well maintained with the buffer mowing, just trying to make it clear this is on purpose and there is a long-term goal, and here's what you can picture this looking like in 5, 10, 20 years. If you can pull all that off, we do estimate that in a 10-year time span, a conversion from turf grass to native plantings can reduce your cost of maintenance up to 63% 10-year period. And next slide, I'm going to talk about two specific project sites that are more in the gathering space type. So the first one is Carter Park Extension. This is 27 parcels of previously vacant land, a little over 3 acres. It's in the Walnut Park East neighborhood in Northwest City. This is a neighborhood that's about 30 to 40% vacant properties at any given time. And the location was determined again by that combination of GIS modeling and community input. One of the main things about this site is that it's directly adjacent to an existing city park. It's a half block of vacant land that was separated from the park only by an alley. So it was a really nice complement to the park, and that's why it has that temporary name there. So in the beginning, we were focused on planning and design, really cleaning up the lots, doing building demolitions where needed, clearing out old tree lines and fencing, and then working on kind of designing the space while slow activating it as well. So that what that looked like was a series of art installation projects with the high school on the other side of the park. So kind of on the same block as the site. That picture on the top right is from a vacant building board up project where the students worked with the building division to paint and install boards on all of the remaining vacant buildings that were in good condition that could be stabilized and rehabbed. Foundation provides free summer and school camps and programs for girls. Focused on throwing sports, growing food, all kinds of things. And so we're now that we have that active partner, we have years of planning and design, and this year we're going to move into our final construction phases. Next slide. This is if you can see the little picture in the middle on the right, that shows you how the space, Carter Park Extension, is just separated by that park, Carter Park by an alley, and that top portion is where the now closed school is. But I'm loving Google Street View for being able to show us these before and afters. So you can see before the project started, the block moving down is just a series of vacant and abandoned buildings and some remnant tree lines and fencing. And then on the bottom is a much newer picture there of how the site has been transforming over the years. Next slide. And the Throwing and Growing Foundation has since installed 2 recycled shipping containers that they use for programming for their camps. On the bottom there is a picture of a competition grade throwing field. So this is now a certified competition grade field for shot put, discus, javelin, hammer, weight throw. So in addition to teaching at the camps, can host competitions and events. And so over the next year or two, we'll be installing a cistern, a giant underground cistern under that athletic field that's going to capture stormwater off the park and the surrounding areas and allow us to use that water back on site for the garden. We're installing a permeable pavement parking lot, a bathroom in one of the storage containers, and then all of the non-turf land of that block will be converted to native landscaping. And so really excited to see the progress coming over the next couple of years on this site. Now, the next slide, the final project site I wanted to talk about today is called Peace Park. This is one entire block of vacant properties, a small block, but a whole block, which is nice. That's about 15 parcels that we own so far, still looking to acquire a couple on the edges. It's in the College Hill neighborhood, about northeast of the part of the city. And this neighborhood is at any given time 50 to 60% vacant properties. It's also the only neighborhood out of our 79 official city neighborhoods that does not have an official city park. So while we call it Peace Park, it's not a city sanctioned park. It's still a community gathering space, but it's called that because it's always been called that. This spot was used as a gathering space, founded mostly by this gentleman, Otis Woodard, who is a human and civil rights activist who used this space to share essentials and connections to resources for low-income and unhoused neighbors in the area. After his death, it did fall into disrepair again. Next slide. And then residents of the neighborhood worked with some local partners and put out a plan to revitalize Peace Park. They worked for several years to gather partners and funding, hosted design charrettes, came up with conceptual designs, created a storytelling video to really put out there and launch a fundraising campaign. And then similar to Carter Park, we had a setback with this one as well, where the lead partner organizations running this project both had to leave the project for various reasons. And it was kind of left without someone to steward this project moving forward. Next slide. So in 2020, it became another Green City Coalition site. And we've been working to move it forward with those conceptual designs created by community. So we created a draft design from the years of work that had been done, and then launched a phase of really getting final feedback on that. We did pop-up tabling events, community meetings, a digital and paper survey phase, reformed a community advisory committee to meet regularly and feed into that. And what we came out on the other side with was final designs and 100% construction drawings. We had to work to acquire a really key property right in the middle of the project area. And we started bringing increased maintenance and oversight to the location as well. Next slide. In 2020, so right next to the site is this historic Corinthian water tower. It's a pretty cool feature. The ground on the bottom right of the picture there is Peace Park. So this is right next to us. And it had also, like the site, kind of fallen into disrepair. So the city water division came in and repaired the roof, did tuck pointing, kept it watertight, and then some local business and construction partners volunteered their time and resources to repaint the tower for the first time in 60 years. So I hope you can see the difference from the picture on the left of it repainted. This is from an event last year to what it looked like a couple years ago. Next slide. And now as we look towards construction, our estimated project cost is almost $1.5 million. We have managed to cobble together about $1 million. It's a combination. Sorry, the slide got wonky. So it's not easy to see there, but it's supposed to be kind of in-kind commitments from our utility company, construction partners, Washington University, and then a series of grants as well. And we're still $400,000 short from meeting the vision that community made for this place. I don't put these here to name drop, but to point out how complicated it is and how many different partners we've needed at the table to piece it all together, both in designing and fundraising and construction along every path of the way. It has been a combination of many, many partners contributing what they can and adding up to the whole there. But finally, we're looking forward to breaking ground in the next few months. And I believe with that, I get to hand it back to Torrey to talk about a collaboration between our collaborations. Next slide. Oh, you can skip that. Thanks. You're muted, Torrey.
Thank you. So yes, the Vacancy Collaborative is a part of the GCC and had come together from one of our project groups, formerly known as the Alternative Land Reuse Group, made up entirely of volunteer members. We found that there was a community need in terms of having a comprehensive guide with specific examples that we looked at from Detroit and Pittsburgh to develop this booklet that we could get into the hands of both average gardeners, residents, neighborhood associations, anyone who was looking to revitalize and green vacant lots. So we worked together based upon the recommendations from that project group to put together content. It went through a number of different versions until we finally were able to release it for, I believe it was the beginning of last year. And we also put a version of that on our website. Next slide. So the basics, we really went through a little bit of everything as far as it being an introduction to those who had not necessarily gone through the process. And we really wanted to talk about from beginning to end, purchasing a lot, what you need to get started, lining up financing, having a plan for different types of projects that would fit the space, resources, both financial and gardening experts that they could tap into, and a number of different kinds of landscaping plans, which we can go into a little bit further down the line. Next slide. So just a couple snapshots of where of what's in the book. From the starting, we have downloadable worksheets, or you can pull them from the printed version. Talks about how to build your team, hopefully from other community residents and interested parties. Taking a look at the site conditions and what's needed, putting together and outlining your the layout of your lot, and thinking about, what does a budget look like? How do you know that your project is successful in terms of milestones? And I think a lot of what we do there is to provide multiple examples because with this, it's not a one size fits all application. Next slide. So another kind of example that we learned from Detroit and Pittsburgh was really to make sure that people are using a variety of tools, of plants and other items that folks wouldn't necessarily consider to have that diversity. And so it's a very visual piece to just lay out and take some of the guesswork out of it. And there are a lot of different kinds of projects that folks can determine what's right for that space. Next slide. Talking about community resources, there are a number of different nonprofit organizations and semi-governmental organizations, such as Operation Brightside. We've got Seed St. Louis that tends to do a lot of community gardens, Pocket Parks, which is self-explanatory, and a number of them have more resources and staffing to be able to partner with some of these neighborhood organizations and to lay out a plan from, again, knowing what kind of plantings you're wanting to put in, whether it's sun or shade or what other kinds of soil conditions that you're working with. Maintenance calendar is very important. We find that particularly with the data that we have for the LRA, that a lot of those lots are not necessarily able to be maintained on a regular basis. So you need to have something in place. And then, of course, we prioritize native plants as far as being both sustainable and preferable to the environment. Next slide. And of course, we have a readiness tool. This is a scoring rubric that helps people to evaluate the likelihood of success for your project. This was also developed by Pocket Parks and the Alternative Land Reuse group to come up with a way that not only gets you to where you are in terms of scoring your readiness in the beginning, but has suggestions as far as additional things that you can change to make it more successful. Next slide. And we've talked a lot about the booklet, but just wanted to mention that we also made the Vacant Lot Toolkit available on the Vacancy Collaborative website. Did a little bit of analytics and found that it is the second most visited page on our website, right after the Vacant Property Explorer that I went over earlier. And, just thinking about the fact that we've already printed and distributed 500 booklets in actually 2022 and 2023. And we're about to do a second round of printing. So it's very popular. And just to mention that we were notified that that the booklet itself won 2 American Society of Landscape Architecture awards for St. Louis and the Prairie Gateway chapters. Next slide. Okay, and then just to wrap it up on the combination of the Vacant Lot Toolkit and the Vacant Lot Small Grants Program that is being developed by the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative. Right now, as we're looking at a reprint, we notice that there are a number of references and sections that, due to a change or elimination of LRA purchase programs, need to be revised. We've identified additional resources that need to be added, and of course, the increased demand from partners and neighborhood groups. And then this coincides with the Vacant Lot Toolkit's usage for our brand new small grants program. And the idea behind this is that it would be about $1,500 to $5,000 to support neighborhood groups in creating green spaces on vacant lots, using those tools that are provided, and any additional support. We're really looking to make sure that the projects will reduce vacancy, engage the community, and of course, primarily center equity and inclusivity. And then lastly, there are a number of inputs such as the public reading project readiness, grantee reporting, and periodic review from the VC team that we will use to measure progress. I think that's it. Do we want to go to the last slide? All right, just wanted to say thank you very much for listening to Laura and I today, and we're certainly open for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Torrey. That was a lot of information. Laura, I loved how you said, let me talk about the collaboration between our collaborations. I think that really speaks to the amount of work that has gone into these partnerships in the city. And I'm just struck by the different types of support and services and projects you all are able to help implement and lead implementation on, and then the technical assistance and resources that the Vacancy Collaborative is able to provide. It's really, really inspirational. We have a lot of questions in the chat, a lot related to the projects, Laura, but before I get there, our first questions came in, Torrey, when you were speaking, was about how did you identify the different partners to come to the Vacancy Collaborative? And I'll provide some additional context that in community progress's work in communities across the country, that's really a critical piece, is having that like designated group of individuals that have agreed to take these part of this on as their charge and their responsibility. So can you share a little bit about the origins of the Vacancy Collaborative and how those folks came to the table, either through self-identification or through different priorities of their own?
Sure. And so I will say that I'm familiar with the history. I joined a few years later, and so I welcome Laura to fill in any additional blanks there. But essentially, this came out of community conversations organized by an entity here in St. Louis known as the St. Louis Association of Community Organizations, or SLACO for short. We deal with a lot of acronyms in our work. But they led the conversation because I think there were just casual conversations happening in terms of no one entity was working on this issue. St. Louis is quite siloed, and everybody is sort of doing their own thing, especially in the nonprofit world. And so it made sense to identify those folks and groups that were already taking a piece of that. So obviously, SLACO was a major partner from the beginning and helped guide that conversation. Legal Services of Eastern Missouri takes on the court/legislative piece, often in terms of code enforcement issues. And so I think there were also like a number of academics that got involved, particularly in both economic and community development. And then folks from SLDC, such as Laura, also were a big part of that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go into some of the project-based questions and going to try to pose them in order of like how projects come to be. So one of the questions that we have is, Laura, while you were talking about the different projects that the GCC has helped to implement, who owns the properties during the construction phase and then after the development phase is completed?
Yeah, so properties currently that we're developing are land bank owned. They are property of the LRA. They're not available for purchase. Part of the agreement that I mentioned at the beginning, those partnership agreements, states that the LRA will provide those properties for these projects, will maintain, insurance on them, and will transfer them in the case that a new ownership entity is established, like the Community Land Trust. So of our 8,500, lots that we own, there's only about 200 that are designated to GCC. So it's really a kind of a drop in the bucket for the land bank, unfortunately, but a higher impact for the residents nearby. And I know there were questions about then what happens if you transfer. And so, it's been a slow process creating the idea for the Community Land Trust ownership. And that's because we've really been working to make sure that the long-term costs of maintenance are built in on day one before that gets launched. So we have $1 million maintenance endowment from the Missouri Department of Conservation. And we've been working to get match funds to kind of layer on top of that. But the idea is that land trust has 2/3 representation from the neighborhoods where the green spaces are, kind of 1/3 from the larger region. and that it can be an entity that also kind of spearheads inclusive and equitable development around those spaces, so that the green spaces are the founding for that, but that it can grow into something more like a CDC. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And since there is the hope that these properties are ultimately transferred to a community land trust, the expectation is that they're permanent green spaces. Is that
Yes.
a correct assumption? Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful.
And part of that is, so planning's role is rezoning, reclassifying the land use for those locations. It's really solidifying those as permanent open space for communities moving forward.
Great. So there's another question related to community control and defining community control, which I think we touched on a little bit, but kind of the second part of the question is what financial resources and TA is made available to support and sustain the long-term projects moving forward. So I don't know if there's TA that would be anticipated on the land trust side that GCC or the Vacancy Collaborative would be involved with, but could you share a little bit about what the vision is there?
I mean, I'll be honest, the long-term maintenance is the unsolved challenge for absolutely everything we are talking about. Whether it stays vacant or it becomes something else, it's still an open space property that requires maintenance in perpetuity. And I'm not sure anyone's quite solved that in the long run. I think that's one of the things we're trying to just encourage on the front end with the vacant lot toolkit is if you're going into investing in a project like this, consider what the maintenance requirements are going to be on the front end and work from day one to get that lined up, and consider that into what you're building. What's the feasibility, and how does what you're building change what you're going to need for maintenance moving forward? And unfortunately, I unless Torrey, you can think of something else, we don't have the answer to that in the long term. Financial resources to sustain these spaces. It's something that we're still working on at a systems level, approach.
Yeah, and I would agree. With our small grants program, this is the first year that we're trying this out, and the grants aren't it's small grants. So they aren't very big. They're not going to make that much of an impact the first time around, but it's a pilot program that we want to see how it does. And we're hoping at least on the VC side to find more funding. I think there's an interest, especially in groups that are focused on environmental issues that would want to fund that program further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would reiterate that it's one of the challenges community progress hears most often is how do we find that dedicated financial support for maintaining these properties into the future. And so can appreciate that it continues to be a challenge for you all, and we're engaged in conversations to hopefully add some additional resources to that space. So Julia, I see you've come on the screen. I know we're up on time, so thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you guys for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Laura, Torrey, and Liz for your time. If you have any lingering questions, please feel free to reach out to our presenters. We'll be sending an email in the coming week with slides and a recording and their contact information. So we encourage you to reach out. Please be sure to visit our website at communityprogress.org and join our mailing list to stay up to date with any new webinar announcements. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.